In the IELTS speaking test, how would you answer the question, what sort of things do you read? We could just give a short list of nouns such as books, comics and blog posts. However, that won't get a very high score in the speaking test. So in this episode, we're going to cover a range of suggestions for ways that you can expand your answer and achieve a higher score. Hi, my name's Vic and this is episode 20 of the IELTS with Vic podcast. Remember, if you want a free copy of the podcast transcript, just head over to my IELTS blog to request it. So, let's get started by thinking about the kinds of things that people read. Here are a few examples. Newspapers, novels, comics, manga, magazines, textbooks, technical manuals, blogs, websites, and emails. These are just a few examples, and you may have other things that are relevant to your own situation. If there are any missing from that list which are relevant to you, take a few moments to check the correct term in a reliable dictionary. These days, it's really common for people to read using electronic devices, but some people also choose to read printed versions of certain things. So one way that we can expand our answer in a meaningful way is to say whether we read paper copies of the things we read or digital copies. Here are a few useful phrases that may be relevant to you. I do most of my reading on my mobile phone. I tend to read work-related things on my laptop. When I'm reading to relax, I normally use my Kindle. I prefer to read novels on my tablet. I really enjoy reading paper books. I prefer to read online magazines. I prefer reading printed newspapers. Obviously, you can combine aspects of these phrases to create an answer which is personalised to your own situation. For example, my own answer to this question is as follows. Although I often read novels, I normally read them on my tablet using either the Kindle app or Google Books. I very rarely read paper books these days, unless I'm studying a language, in which case I prefer to use a paper textbook, as I like being able to make physical notes. Hopefully you noticed that I added a couple of adverbs there. We had often and rarely. Other useful words you could use are generally, normally, typically, and usually. For example, I generally read on my phone. I normally read on my laptop. I typically read using my Kindle. I usually read on my tablet. Earlier I used the phrase I tend to do something, which has the same meaning as I generally do something. I also used the phrase I prefer, as in I prefer to read novels on my tablet. This has the pattern I prefer to do something. You might have noticed earlier that I also said I prefer reading printed newspapers. This has the pattern I prefer doing something. The thing to note here is that the verb prefer can be followed by either to do or ing. Let's have a few more examples. I prefer to read my emails on my phone. I prefer reading my emails on my phone. I prefer to read digital magazines. I prefer reading digital magazines. Let's have a slightly longer example now, with some more examples of preferences. I read a lot of emails for my job, mainly using my laptop. However, I do have to print some of the important emails and annotate them by hand. I like to read online newspapers on my phone, but I also get a paper magazine delivered once a month. It's an art magazine, so I prefer to get the paper version as I can cut out the pictures that I really like. In that example, I gave the reason why I like the paper version of the art magazine. I said, as I can cut out the pictures that I really like. In this sentence, as has the same meaning as because. So we could equally have said, because I can cut out the pictures that I really like. Let's have another example using both options. I like to read on my phone as it is more convenient. I like to read on my phone because it is more convenient. Earlier, we noted that the verb prefer can be followed by either to do or ing. Not all verbs behave in this way, so we do need to learn the pattern for each verb as we go. However, the verb like, which I used in that last example, does follow this same pattern. So we can say, I like to do something and I like doing something. Here's an example. I like to read on my phone as it is more convenient. I like reading on my phone as it is more convenient. One thing we haven't covered yet is reading blogs, forums and apps with user-generated content. There are lots of sites and apps that are popular for reading these days. For example, in the UK, both Reddit and Substack are quite popular for reading a wide range of content. I know a number of people who are big fans of these apps and do a lot of their reading on these services. How about you? Do you have a specific app, blog or forum that you like to read? If so, that's something that you could talk about in your answer. Finally then, if your answer is quite short because you don't do a lot of reading these days, you might want to find something else to say. I think there are two main ways you could expand a very short answer. The first way would be to compare your current reading with how much you read in the past. For example, unfortunately, these days I rarely do any reading, as my work is quite practical and I have no time in the evenings for reading. Alternatively, you could express your opinion about your current lack of reading. Here are two contrasting examples. Although I don't do much reading these days, I'm not really bothered, as I never actually enjoyed reading anyway. Unfortunately, I don't get a chance to read as much as I would like, and I hope that in the future I can make more time for reading about current affairs. As always, don't try to cram all of the aspects from today's episode into your answer. Remember, this is a part 1 question, so we need to say a few good sentences rather than a huge paragraph. I just wanted to give you lots of possible options. To summarise then, you could mention which types of material you read, and perhaps whether you read them in paper version or digitally. You might also choose to mention how often you read these different things. Now that we're coming to the end of this episode, I recommend taking a few minutes to create your own expanded answer to the question, what sort of things do you read? Why not get some extra practice by posting a few sentences in the comments? Looking at the most recent poll on YouTube, it seems like the next topic chosen by those who voted is what do you do when you have a holiday? Thanks to everyone who voted. Thanks for joining me today, and don't forget, if you want a free copy of the podcast transcript, then head over to my IELTS blog and fill in the form. See you next episode for lots of useful phrases for talking about things you do on holiday. Thanks for listening, and have a great day.